the tool is used in reality in our friaries. And I think that most, like I even use Gmail or my Google Calendar at our friary meetings. So I'm unconstitutional in that sense. And it's very easy with the tool. The tool is extraordinary, right? It helps us to do almost anything. And it's very easy unintentionally to bring it in and allow it to be used. And that's why we're bringing this discussion up, because we need to be able to be aware of what its capabilities are, what's the mission. And I would dare say that many of us don't believe that the internet or those that are providing it through the equipment that has been given to us have a specific intention, which, you know, after reading several of the books, I think we're naive in that area. And I don't want us to be naive when we're discerning. The internet, this is my own kind of a perspective, would be almost like a counterfeit to the Holy Spirit. All knowing, can answer almost anything, can give us power in all kinds of different apps. It's a poor alternative, but I think that it's an effective alternative in society, mostly because it affects our brains. And as men, we tend to be much more heady and fascinated by things rather than the heart. I've asked several different brothers. I've got different brothers working on different reflections. And this is all, again, aiming at a communal discernment at that legitimate place for the community, which is the general chapter. So this is the beginning of a preparation for this discussion, but I think we need to educate ourselves so that we make intentional decisions and not be unintentional in how we're going forward. I think one of the intentional ways that we've gone forward as specifically using it as an instrument, I've asked Father Mark Mary. Father Mark Mary is a younger friar, fairly newly ordained, working specifically in communications, using the internet, using social media in a very specific way to encounter the culture. And he's done a lot of studying. Everything he's doing is step-by-step discerning, going forward, trying to get protections also for him and for his vocation, because there's a lot of things that he's involved in, but he's very well disciplined. And he's the one that I've approved of moving forward, and we're protecting him as well in some ways that I see best. I'd like to just ask him, are you here? Yeah. To just speak a few minutes, probably 2 or 3 minutes, just on the intentionality of using the tool as a good tool that it is, but using it intentionally. So Father Mark Mary, if you want to, I don't know if you're visible. Yeah.
2 to 3. Hey guys, I guess just to confirm, I think the struggle is real, the fruitfulness is real. The fruits of it is I've come across whatever people talking to us, and I assume a lot of you have heard from it as well. Is like it's really, some of our media work is really helping people, and particularly in this COVID time, a lot of people were responding to that. What we were doing was a source of grace for them. And yesterday we just had our first YouTube video hit 1 million views, and it's Father Malachi and I just praying a rosary together with nothing more than that. And there's some 90-year-old grandma who prays the rosary with us every night and calls us her boys. You know, so it can be used and it can be fruitful and even lead people to pray. But even just my own reflection and some adjustments we've made, it's it is a space that you have to be careful of, and the struggles and the temptations are real. And this is nothing we have to make up. Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II on the World Communications Days both said, like, yeah, this is a great instrument and the church needs to be there, but also you just can't be dumb. You have to, be intentional about it. And so I think I think the discernment and the intentionality is great, that it can be and has been fruitful, and it can be certainly dangerous as well. So that's just my experience and my thoughts.
So Father John, we've asked you to come in and at least to give us a little bit of an introduction, someone who has studied social media and its effects. You're a religious as well as a Jesuit. understanding how I'm sure the Jesuits have a lot on social media and do a lot, but we're looking forward to hearing from you. I'm sure we'll have questions and answers afterwards, but I'm grateful to you, and have at it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. It really is a joy to be able to speak to all of you, dear friars, on this topic. I've known the friars probably since my Steubenville days, but that was 25 years ago, and intermittently over the years with individual friars, and my own heritage, I might say. I can claim, a great debt that I owe to the charism of Francis and Clare. My godmother, the godmother of my baptism, has been a Poor Clare sister in British Columbia for 45 years. So I'm fairly convinced I owe my vocation to her prayers and intercession. And beyond that, even my Jesuit vocation, the conversion of St. Ignatius would not have happened had he not been reading the life of Francis of Assisi on his convalescent bed after the famous cannonball incident. So anyway, lots of gratitude to you and the charism that you bear to this day. And it sounds like you're really already launched on a profound reflection of this reality of social media. You've got the two books I probably would have recommended to you, Nicholas Carr's The Shallows and Adler's the book Irresistible, on the addictive nature of media. But it also seems like you've done reflection on its positive potential as a tool for evangelization. And that, I think, is the fine line that we have to navigate as religious and also just as discerning individuals, is how do we keep it a tool? Because some of the more deeper minds, Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, others, are the ones who have really grasped, I think, that there's something a bit seductive and sometimes deceiving about the tool-like nature of these media. Because as Marshall McLuhan said, we always make our tools and then our tools make us. He was the master of the pithy saying, that captured an underlying truth. So he said, he also coined that phrase, the medium is the message. So I think I'm going to be in his footsteps and speaking in that line of thought a fair bit this morning. I'm going to talk about three things. First is, how is technology shaping humanity today, more or less? Secondly, what are the pros and cons of that technology from the tradition and from some of the great minds? And then thirdly, I'll just propose some criteria for discernment. I think that's just the best way of going forward on this question. And forgive me if you've heard some of this before, but as we say in our Jesuit world, Ignatian repetition sometimes drives home the point. So I'll just begin with my own, the origins of my interest in this topic come from my past. I was born in a small Rocky Mountain town in British Columbia, which was the last village in North America to get television. It had gotten television by the time I was born, but when my mom was born in that town in the 50s, there was no TV, and they didn't get TV until the 70s, about 20 years after the rest of the world got television. And this town was a very remarkable case, because in the absence of TV, this little blue collar kind of railroad, mining, forestry, town, their elementary school and their high school had some of the highest grade percentage averages, in the whole country, in the whole country of Canada. They were performing academically extremely well. Also, they were a town that really was formed around community. The amount of public events, sports days, festivals, harvest days, fairs, all those kinds of things were greater than most other towns of its type. My mother remembers growing up in this culture. And then one year, McBride, that was the name of the town, McBride was going to get television. The government, they had petitioned the government, and the government was building these relay towers to finally beam TV into that valley. Because that was the reason it couldn't have TV. It was just its location in the mountains made it difficult to get reception. So all these sociologists from the University of British Columbia rush up to McBride and say, we're going to study the heck out of this place. And then we'll come back 2 years later after TV and see what we see what effects or changes there might have been, which they did. And they wrote a book about it. And this book is still held up to this day as kind of a great example of both sociological research, but to my mind, as an illustration of Marshall McLuhan's insight that the medium is the message, which is to say, we focus a lot on content of media, but let's not be naive about the transformative effect of the medium itself on the human individual and on the society in which human individuals live. So, are you curious, like, what was the effects of TV on this town? Well, number one, the academic performance of the kids went down. It went down to the average of the rest of the country. Number two, a lot of those communitarian events frittered away. They stopped being organized. People stayed at home more. Elderly people stayed at home more. This was one of the observable effects. The levels of violence and fighting in the schoolyard, things like this went up. So basically, literacy went down and violent behavior went up, let's say. And this is just the secular reporting on it. And so the town was never the same again. And it is perhaps a cautionary tale about the power of the introduction of a technology into a society. Now, not all technologies are going to have a deleterious effect on a society, but we'd be naive to think that it doesn't have an effect on a society. And so I think maybe the second story that illustrated this phenomenon for me was more recent. It was when I was discerning my own vocation, and I went media free for 2 years. I was in, except for writing papers on computers. I was living in Rome and at this place called the Casa Balthazar, which was a house of discernment for young men. And I had thrown away my cell phone. This is 2006 to 2008. And a couple things. I learned how to pray, I would say, for the first time really in my life. Like meditating on the gospel, entering into the scriptures, that kind of prayer. I think my mind was too preoccupied by the spectrum of digital stimulation for most of my prior life. But there I learned to, through unplugging, really connect with the living Word of God. And it was also those 2 years that a quantum shift took place globally. The cell phone became the smartphone. The internet, which till then had been restricted to your desktop, was something that we now carried with us 24/7 in our pocket. We had access to all the information of the world and connectivity. And secondly, social media arose. This new phenomenon of Facebook. I remember emailing. I was still emailing people. I emailed someone from back home, and he said, "Hey, I saw your sister on Facebook." And I remember thinking to myself, "Hey, what is Facebook, and why are you looking at my sister?" But it was just, that was very new. It was like this idea now that we could interact in real time, which on the surface, not a bad thing, not a bad idea. I came back to North America. I joined the Jesuit novitiate in Montreal, and it seems like by 2008, 2009, this was a changed society. People were now immersed in some other, where they were physically present, but they were obviously cognitively and perhaps also emotionally at a remove. And I saw things I'd never seen before. People people sitting at meals in restaurants, but all 4 people or 5 people looking at their phones. Like, it's commonplace now, but it was bizarre then to see, and so on. So I think right from the beginning of my own Jesuit life, I've had this thought, and now in ordained life, hearing confessions and having an awareness of how people are prospering or struggling, that there's a conflict between what I call screens and spirituality. Most people struggle with prayer, having a prayer life, a disciplined or regular prayer life. Most people struggle with sort of an integrated sexuality is vis-a-vis screens and the sort of the rabbit hole of gazing at their screens, and so on. So I believe it is the definitive issue of our day, and that the church is called, Father Steve Gruneau. He's the CEO of Word on Fire Ministries. He's kind of the behind the scenes guy for Bishop Barron. He told a gathering, an online gathering of Jesuit scholastics, that he thinks we need to be discerning these questions more, that the church needs to do what you're doing right now as a community, which is to say, discern the signs of the times. What is this emerging and converging entity called the internet, with its exponentially increasing power over our lives, but also objective power, the artificial intelligence that is now building behind the scenes is extraordinary. What are the implications for what we believe and what we do? For what we believe is the body of Christ, and what we believe is our mission of evangelization. So that's mostly by way of prelude. I'm now going to talk about the technology shaping humanity today. So 3.8 billion people are now using social media, basically half the world, these figures are from looking back at 2019. It's probably big. It's probably more now. It's after the COVID year. But 4 billion people essentially are on social media. And globally, an average user is spending almost 7 hours a day online. If we allow for 7 hours of sleep a day, we see that we're now spending just as much time immersed in online as we are immersed in the restorative embrace of slumber. And it means we're spending at least 40% of our waking time online. And there's some variance from country to country there. Interestingly enough, the Philippines actually has the highest average of hours spent online at almost 10 hours a day. Japan is one of the shortest, with about 4.5 hours a day. Canada, 6 hours a day. The United States, 6 hours, 45 minutes, almost 7 hours a day. So the typical North American is spending 100 days of the year online. If you scrunched all those hours together, out of 365 days, 100 of those are spent immersed online. And the vast majority of those people are using social media. They're using Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and so on. And Facebook is the dominant medium still, although it's had a few challengers in recent years. But they historically and very recently passed the 2.5 billion average monthly users. So not everyone with an account is included in that number, but those who log on to Facebook at least once a month, that's kind of the benchmark of measure. And that number is continuing to grow steadily. And keep in mind, China has its own social media products. So this isn't even including China. So not including China, 1/3 of the world is on Facebook. And if you just count adults who are young adults, kind of in that 18 to 34-year-old bracket, half of that bracket is on Facebook alone. Other niches, other aspects or angles, gaming, video gaming. 4 out of 5 internet users are playing video games every month. The amount of money being spent on video games is astronomical. It was $150 billion just in 1 year. And They say the global gaming community is 3.5 billion people. So I recently read someone saying gaming has now eclipsed music as being the popular medium of discourse among young people. It's now gaming. What about watching videos? Well, needless to say, everyone watches YouTube videos. YouTube is claiming 3 billion different people watch a YouTube video every month. So it's obviously most people watch more than once a month. And 2/3 of all internet users are now using streaming entertainment services. 2/3. So billions of people are subscribed to Netflix, etc. And as you're probably aware, especially during the pandemic, people are binge watching Netflix. They're spending hours going from show to show. Okay. Yeah, and then just my own experience with young people. Even back when I was teaching at Corpus Christi College, which was a couple years ago now, I left there in 2014, so 6.5 years ago. But even then, I remember hearing that stat that young people, if you ask them, if you poll them to list all their activities online, they're spending between 7 and 8 hours a day plugged in, as it were. And I would do the same poll. I would poll my classes. These were freshmen and sophomores, so 18, 19-year-olds. And then I would correlate the data I got back from my class as a sample group. And sure enough, it verified the official stat. About 52 hours a week online, about 7 to 8 hours a day. So I expect those number of screen hours have gone up. Which brings us then to the question, why are people spending so much time online? And I think we have to look at what they're doing. And it's not writing papers or working on spreadsheets. It's mainly the activities I just described. And the reason they're spending all that time there is because of the addictive nature of these media, okay, which has been described very well in some of the books that you've been reading. And I'm going to actually, since some of those books have been published, there's been even more insight into what these companies have been designing. But basically, the technology has made it possible. There's a lot going on behind the scenes of each of those platforms in which they are learning about their users' personalities, habits, preferences. There's sophisticated algorithms that are always working. They're always gathering data to create this ever-perfecting profile of each person. Now, they're not doing it for nefarious reasons, unless you think advertising is completely nefarious. But they are doing it for profit. They're doing it so that they can rent out this information to other companies for astronomical amounts of money. Every like you have made, every click you have made, how much time you spend on a page looking at what kind of photograph. If you like boats, they know that you've spent 3 minutes gazing at a boat picture, and that informs the profile that you have. They know much more about us than we thought they knew when Nicholas Carr was writing The Shallows and those other books. It's all measured. It's not science fiction or futuristic. The future is here already. And never in the history of advertising could media offer such targeted audiences as a product for other companies. And remember, most of these media are free for users. But as they say, if you're not paying for a product, then you are the product. So it's a vast system. Nobody's monitoring it. Humans engineered it, but there's no single person supervising it. It's sort of taken on its own life. It's building profiles from vast data sets, and it is working. And there's actually a professor there in New York, Shoshana Zoldoff, who's written a book called Surveillance Capitalism. And she's got some good insights. Although the book is a bit difficult to read, probably needed an editor. But her thesis is a good one. It's It's she's a Harvard business. Oh wait, she's not in New York. She's Harvard. Yeah, Harvard Business School. But she notes that these companies have become the richest companies in the history of humanity because they're offering something unprecedented to advertisers: great predictions about responses on the parts of humans. And to be able to predict that, you need these huge data sets and to predict how people will act, right? There's another author, Jaron Lanier, he's written this little book called, what's it called? 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts. And he's part of this cohort of former executives and engineers from the top social media companies who have left the industry and are now trying to promote more ethical uses of it. And he's written in this book, he says what the companies are doing is, he calls it BUMMER. It's an acronym, BUMMER, which stands for, this is their product and we're the product. And he's saying what they're selling is the behavior of users, which is modified and then made into an empire for rent. The behavior of users gets modified and then made into an empire for rent. So I don't know if he was forcing the acronym a little bit, but I think he's right. I think he's onto something here. His angle is that it's not just that our data is harvested and then our the advertising on our social media feeds gets personalized. Why is that so bad necessarily? Maybe it's better that I see advertisements for theology books on my feed than advertisements for umbrellas. I don't know. But what he is saying is that no, it's they're not just trying to find the best advertisements for users. They're also modifying the behavior of the users. They're subtly manipulating the things that we desire by a million choices that they put in to perfect their algorithms. Okay, so why are we such willing participants of this system? And it really is what Nicholas Carr described very well in The Shallows. It's a dopamine reward system. It's a dopamine reward system. And what's come clear, I think, even in the 10 years since he wrote that book, is that many of the top engineers of these companies are graduates of the Stanford School for Persuasive Behavior. It's a lab, it's an institute at Stanford University that studies how to have people conform their behaviors to certain activities. It's social psychology. It's habit formation. It's the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab. So as you might suspect, it's the world's top lab for understanding human behaviors and how to manipulate them. So Silicon Valley essentially is based upon this premise and this operation. Sean Parker was once the president of Facebook, and he spends a lot of time now trying to advocate for people to unplug. He says it literally changes your relationship with society, with each other. It probably interferes with your productivity. God only knows what it's doing to your children's brains. And then he says, basically, when Facebook was being developed, the objective was, how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? It's a social validation feedback loop. He said, it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. He said, the inventors, me, Mark Zuckerberg, Instagram guy, it's all of these people. We understood this consciously and we did it anyway. Another engineer, Chamath Palihapitiya, he was the vice president of something called user growth at Facebook before he left, has said he feels tremendous guilt over his work on tools that he says, quote, are ripping apart the social fabric of how society works. The short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that we've created are destroying society. There's no civil discourse. There's no cooperation. It's misinformation and mistruth. So some of these speakers, these figures, are decrying what they see as the fake news effect as well, the echo chamber result, the fact that these media tend us to places where we only interact with like-minded people. And the propensity for conspiracy theories to result. I think we've had a great example of that in the past half year. And we've seen just how politics and society at large has become so polar. I mean, it's almost, you'd think there was almost a like it's this whole 50-50, divide of the American population, politically, culturally. Like, why is it almost divided down the middle, 50-50? That's so bizarre to me. But I think media has aided and abetted this in its tendency to put us into increasingly polemical and partisan camps. Marshall McLuhan, that great media philosopher from the University of Toronto in the 1960s and 70s, predicts all of this. He predicts all of this. He doesn't just say there's going to be a global village. He says the electronic media is going to bring back tribalism, a neo-tribalism. It's going to put people in this mentality that it's us versus them. We have to defend the tribe. It's a life and death stakes. And he just saw this coming with television, to begin with. From here, we can look at the symptoms of mental health. Anyone who's in education has been concerned with this, I'd say for the last 10 years, but the rates have spiked in the last couple years. But it correlates very significantly with the rise of the smartphone and social media. Hospitalizations for teenage girls, for example, for depression and were relatively stable. The rates were pretty stable statistically till about 2010, when social media happened. And then they just spiked by like 62%. For older teens, like 15 to 18, it spiked like 189%, and it hasn't changed since then. So correlation doesn't guarantee causality, of course, but it doesn't take a genius to realize that what we do with our time determines our moods and our mental states. And I think you can ask anybody, how do they feel emotionally or spiritually after spending 15, 20, 30 minutes on Facebook or online? Why does it leave us anxious, depressed, or as we might say, heavy of heart? This is why I try and teach Ignatius's discernment of spirits, and also the practice of the daily examen to young people, because I think without these tools, it's really hard to release ourselves from the grip of this disincarnational miasma and the spirits that they induce upon prolonged exposure. This is Marshall McLuhan. He says, pay attention. Marshall McLuhan said, we have to first pay attention to ourselves and to the impact of communications media. Ignatius's rules of discernment of spirits, what's its first objective? That we first pay attention to our interior motions, our inner movements. Then the second outcome is to know what they are. And then the third is what to do about them. So paying attention to them, understanding them, and what to do about them. Okay. Well, dear friends, there's something very unprecedented at the scale of this new internet, this new emerging and converging entity that we still call the internet. To get a sense of how big it's becoming and its exponential growth, and by that I mean just since 2019, like the last 2 years, these industries, they've always been big. They've been big for some time, but now they're just skyrocketing. Their market valuations is one indicator of how they're doing. That it measures their sales, it measures their profitability, it measures a lot of things. there is now only 6 corporations in the entire world that are valuated at over $1 trillion. 4 of them are Silicon Valley companies. And all 4 of them have been valuated at that only since 2019. They reached that valuation, and they're continuing to valuate. Apple is nearing the $2 trillion valuation mark already. It's interesting to note that if you combine the big 5, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, that's the name of the company that's Google, and Facebook, those 5 companies are valuated at over $6 trillion. That's bigger than the GDP of every country in the world except for the US and China. So Silicon Valley has more clout, at least in terms of its market valuation, than any country, any nation in the world. Each of those companies taken on their own has more value than the GDP of most countries in the world, except for maybe the top 10. Okay, that's how big they are in terms of power. If by power we mention their monetary value. So it raises some bigger questions about who's running the world, but that's beyond the scope of this particular talk and can take us down some interesting rabbit holes of speculation. But it has made their young founders some of the richest people in history, the history of humanity. It seems like Jeff Bezos, although interestingly, yesterday he just resigned from being the CEO of Amazon, but it's mainly because you can't spend, you don't have enough time in your life to spend $200 billion. That's his personal fortune. He vies with Elon Musk, I think, for being the richest person in the world with $200 billion. Bill Gates still has about 120 billion. Mark Zuckerberg, who's younger than most of us, but he has, as of this month, a personal fortune of about 100 billion. Okay, so it just gives us a sense of the measure, I think, of what's happening. Now, not everything is evil about the internet. And in fact, it's the conveniences and services that they offer us that have allowed us to buy into it, and the convenience. So there's pros and cons to technology. I'm going to talk a little bit about those now. The church has generally been positive about technology and about communications technology in particular. We have always had this intuition, Marshall McLuhan also drew attention to it, that Christ is both the medium and the message. The medium and message converge in his person. The apostles are commissioned to spread the good news. They're media. They're bearers of news that happens to be good. Early Christianity spreads by use of the network of Roman roads, the transportation and communication networks of their day. Would not have been possible without them. Skip forward to the next big leap, the invention of the printing press. Gutenberg, 1439. What's the first book that gets printed in the history of humanity? It's the Bible. 180 copies of the Gutenberg Bible, and possibly scholars think a Catholic dictionary, that 300 copies were printed of this Catholic dictionary. What's the next big leap? Well, electronic media and the radio. Who's the inventor of the radio? Marconi. He's the founder of the Vatican Radio. Vatican Radio is one of the oldest broadcasters of the radio wave, radio content. Very Catholic. Film, and what about film in the 20th century? At first, the church is a bit cautious, concerned about immoral imagery and behaviors. You've got the Legion of Decency and codes such as this, but it gradually moves towards promoting a more cautious use and imitation. And Pius XII issued in 1957 his document Miranda Prosus. Miranda Prosus, Latin for gifts of God. So that kind of captures, I think, the church's mentality about what these media were. They're essentially gifts of God for the furthering of the gospel. Vatican II, Inter Mirifica was the Vatican II document on communications. Even that title, Inter Mirifica, it basically means among the marvelous things, among these marvels, referring to technology. And Vatican II calls for a World Communications Day. It was the only annual, not quite a feast, but the annual event to come out of the council. It's the only worldwide celebration Vatican II called for. So incidentally, it's always the Sunday before Pentecost, which I think is significant for us. Communio et Progressio comes out in 1971. It's still considered the most best document on social communications. It introduces the term social communications. It steers the church's reflection towards the communitarian or social dimension of media, and places it in the great task of evangelization. In Evangelii Nunciandi, a few years later, Paul VI says that in media, the church finds a modern and effective version of the pulpit. So again, the church is just affirming this role of media, a role that I think you friars have utilized here and there at different times with music, with video work, things like that. I think is a great exemplar of this. And then the very last apostolic letter of JP2, it might have been the one you were alluding to in your opening remarks there, but Sviluppo Rapido, on rapid development, 2005. Don't be afraid of the new technologies, he says. They're there at our disposal to use and make known the truth about the dignity and destiny of ourselves as his children, heirs of his kingdom. Okay, so I say all this so that we know loud and clear that the church's dominant position on media and on media technology is one of positivity. Here I'm going to introduce, because the church is always gathering data, though, for her own discernments. And so here I'm going to introduce data that may affect the church's position on this. And these are not from churchy sources, ecclesial sources. These are more from, I would say, wisdom figures or philosophers. But Albert Einstein, the most famous theoretical physicist, even in his day, said the following. He said, "It's become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity." Why did Einstein say that? I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, but it's a great insight into his mind that somehow our technology was eclipsing the prior reflections that should take place about what is humanity and what makes for the good life, what makes for the prospering life at a human level. G.K. Chesterton, one of the great Christian writers, Catholic apologists, said once, "We have no time anymore to think, to consider, to review, to step back and look at the machines that we use and the effects that they're having on us." This is Chesterton. He said, "Civilization has run on ahead of the soul of man and is producing faster than he can think and give thanks." And I love that little twist at the end there. The machines are pushing us faster and faster than we can give thanks. And again, if I can allude back to the Ignatian examen or the examen, the very first step of the examen to have gratitude for the gifts and blessings of the day, I think is just so important. It counters the effects of the narcissism and all the other things that can happen when we're immersed in digital media. So to recover that fundamental sense of gratitude for the gift of existence. There's been a couple of late 20th century philosophers. There seemed to have been a golden age at the University of Toronto in the 60s and 70s. George Grant, Marshall McLuhan, a few others. Some of their students went on to New York University. Neil Postman founded the media ecology movement. And what their reflection was that when you enter the mentality of technology, well, I'll quote George Grant here. He says, "It becomes difficult to know whether we're being deprived of anything that's essential to human happiness, because coming to be of technological society has actually stripped us of the very systems of meaning that would have shown us the higher purposes of humanity. So we don't even have the tools anymore to judge whether the absence of something is now actually a deprival of something. Okay, he's using his philosophical language, but we get the point. If we go back to Martin Heidegger, Heidegger, one of these sort of phenomenologists, he was one who really saw the emerging modern technology. So obviously he's pre-digital world, but Heidegger is seeing the logical progression of what we're now doing with our tools. And he said it's fundamentally changed our relationship with nature. And I think his insight here is that how does truth reveal itself generally, normally, under normal circumstances? And he evokes that beautiful Greek word aletheia, for truth. Truth is something that unveils itself, reveals itself to our minds. But as those words invoke, the unveiling or revealing is a delicate process. It's a gentle process. And it happens, truth comes to us through a plurality of ways, including the poetic or the religious or the artistic or aesthetic modes of truth. I think those involved with classical learning, classical education, still retain some of these modalities of learning and of truth, of coming to know the world. But the modern world has jettisoned most of those in favor of a purely scientific, which translates into a relationship with the natural world that is kind of beating it over the head in order to demand that it reveals its truth to us. And in so doing, modern technology, this is Heidegger still, modern technology reduces our perception of seeing nature as a mere confluence of forces. It's just forces at work, forces to be consumed, rivers to be dammed by hydroelectric dams, and so on and so forth. So from here, there you get a whole Christian ecological movement as well. Wendell Berry and many other thinkers who have, certainly I would say there's a Franciscan approach to these questions too, about right relationship with nature. The Canticle of Creation being, of course, this beautiful symphonic climax of this way of thinking. Jacques Ellul was another philosopher. He's a French Protestant philosopher, 20th century, perhaps the most prophetic in terms of his Jeremiads against modern technology. But Ellul says, look, it's a state of mind. Technique, he uses the French word for technology, technique. He says it's a state of mind, and it enters into every area of human life. It doesn't just become external. It doesn't remain external, but becomes internal and integrated into it absorbs man. It absorbs his way of thinking. And as a Christian philosopher, he said, the antidote is the Christian witness of faith, hope, and love. That's what will break us free from the tyranny of technique. Okay, Jacques Ellul, rest in peace. You can find some of his, there's some grainy interviews with him on YouTube, ironically enough. Yeah, and then of course, I think it brings us to Nicholas Carr and his wonderful book, The Shallows, which, although it is 10 years old, I think really still is the one of the best books you can read on the subject, because he's gathered together most of the neurological studies, the early neurological studies on the effects of the internet. So we come to the internet as this logical conclusion to the logic of modern technology. It's not so much a new medium as a quantum shift of the previous technologies that absorbs them all. It's a pole around which are now converging TV, radio, what we would have called news, and even our social lives and photography, everything. And Carr's book is really helpful in showing us that our brains are formed according to what we contemplate and how we contemplate it. So new understandings of the neuroplasticity, this plastic quality to our brains, are coinciding with the rise of the internet. Neuroscience is learning a lot right now, but it's really right now. It's really happening these days, and we're learning that the mind is pliable. There's good news and bad news about that. The good news is that if we've been addicted to things in the past, we can rewire our brains around that to not be addicted to things. Frankly, I don't think this should be all that surprising to us. Everything I read about neuroscience, how the mind, how the synapses, these neural pathways are formed in the mind, just seems to confirm what our own scriptural tradition tells us, right? Or the ancient Greek philosophers who said, you become what you contemplate. You will become that thing that you gaze upon. And, Carr is not a Christian, but his book, he's an English professor. He talks about how I realized I couldn't sustain my attention like I used to be able to in polishing off these novels, these great works of literature. And he gets as far as saying, and the book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, was the book that came out of an article he wrote originally for Atlantic Monthly called The Shallows, Is Google Making Us Stupid? So his primary thesis is that in spending all that time gazing at a particular something, it's not just gazing at a screen, it's how we're processing what we're looking at. We become that. And so if we're not retaining things, this is another big takeaway from his work, is that the way memory works, short stuff remains in our short-term memory, but doesn't enter our long-term memory because it bottlenecks at the connector between those two spheres of the brain. We need little he uses the image of thimblefuls. We need little thimblefuls of inputs for data to enter our long-term memory. But the internet just deluges us with information. So it's a very different method of reading than reading a book is, for example. Okay. He goes as far as to say this may impair our capacity to acquire wisdom. So I think Carr is in the tradition of sort of the great pagan Greek philosophers. Now, this translates into a great Christian concern. If our society is being defined by what it's doing online, their minds, and grace, as we know, builds on nature. Grace builds on nature, but if the nature has become such that it's resistant to contemplation, let's call it, then it will impair our capacity to be acquirers of wisdom, let alone to hear the still small voice of the living Word of God in our lives. So that to me is the great concern of our day, and but I don't want to leave on a negative note. I'll just conclude with, I think, some criteria for discernment that we can employ. This is, of course, nonetheless meant to be a great cautionary discourse. But one question we can ask and encourage other people to ask is, who was I before all this technology took over my life? It's an existential question we can ask, especially young people. And I'm also going to propose 4 criteria to keep in mind, because these are things that define our humanity as God the Creator intended us to be. And then questions that we can ask ourselves vis-a-vis our internet and social media usage. Number 1, human beings have intellect and will. It's what separates us from the animals. We can't really love or fulfill our vocation to love unless we have free will. So how does my media use affect my free will and influence my freedom? That's discernment criterion number 1. Number two, human beings are a body-soul unity. We're not spirits trapped in a body. Like the Christian view is that we're not dualistic, but we're a composite being. We're composed of a soul that infuses a body. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God looked at everything he had created and saw that it was good. We're an incarnational religion with a sacramental system of grace. So our incarnational side is important. And here's the question here. How does my media use cause disembodiment? How does it separate, so to speak, me from my body, my corporeal presence? Is there discord between my interiority and my physical presence? Okay, and you alluded to, brother, you alluded to Pope Benedict's remarks, and it's true. His last World Communications Day message is one of the ones I thought the church's reflection might be turning a little bit on media. Benedict, what was it called? It was called On Word and Silence. Word and Silence. He says, be careful. He says, it was on social media, actually. He said, be careful about two things. One is being online should never, the community that you find online should always be subordinate to your physical community, the community where your body is, the house you're in, the roof under which you live. Number three, humans live in the here and now, the hic et nunc. We're called not to be obsessed with the past and dwelling on our past. Usually that's a cause for desolation for most. And we're not supposed to be obsessed with the future and concerned with the future. Consider the lilies of the field. So we're meant to live in the present, the eternal present. It's really where we find God. And perhaps those of you who have read in your spiritual reading the de Caussade's book, The Sacrament of the Present Moment, also known as, what's its other title? Anyway, Abandonment to Divine Providence. That book is all about learning to live in the present, in the here and now, that God speaks to us in the now. So just as the second criterion was, is media causing me disembodiment? This third question is media causing me temporal displacement? In other words, dislodging me from my sense of living in the present. Okay. These are broad questions, but I think I'll pose them as such. And then the fourth one is, we're called to universal love. All of us, all human beings are called to grow and learn to love humanity as God loves humanity, right? If you wish to be perfect, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, I should say. What does that mean? Well, he causes the sun to shine on the good and evil alike, and the rain to fall on the good and evil alike. In other words, God's love is universal to all people. We're called to imitate that. So how is my media use contributing to my fundamental vocation to be a universal lover? Or is it leading me into the mentality of forming cliques and cocoons and tribes and these kinds of groupings? The neo-tribalism of the online world that McLuhan warned about. One other criterion, Neil Postman, McLuhan's great student. He's written a number of wonderful books, Technopoly, Amusing Ourselves to Death, a lot of great books from the 80s and 90s. And he says, this is a question that should be asked of every new technology. What is the problem to which this technology is the solution? He's got some great videos online as well. And he has this hilarious discourse where he talks about a salesman trying to get him to spend a few extra $1,000s to have power windows on this car. It's a car salesman. And he's looking at it saying, like, why do I need power windows again? Well, they're automatic. Okay. Well, it's an image or a metaphor for basically everything that comes out digitally now. Why do we need it in our lives again? And McLuhan said, every new technology is enhancing something, but it's also displacing something. It's obsolescing something else. Okay. And then one of my favorite philosophers is Albert Borgman. Albert Borgman teaches at the University of Montana. And he points to how a lot of electronic and digital media are substituting for other things. You just think computer games have replaced board games. Email has replaced letter writing, and you can substitute everything else. But they're not rewarding us like the old technologies used to. They're easier to enter, but their payoff is less. And he encourages us as an antidote to this digital miasma to do real things with our lives. He calls them focal practices. Organize meals together, play musical instruments, do outdoor activities, things humans that give life and joy to human beings. This was Pope Benedict's last word, 2012, his last world communications message. When messages and information are plentiful, silence becomes essential if we are to distinguish what is important from what is insignificant or secondary. And for this to happen, it is necessary to develop an appropriate environment, a kind of ecosystem that maintains a right equilibrium between silence, words, images, and sounds. I think that as bearers of the gospel, one of the ways we have to pastorally accompany people is to help them acquire a right ecosystem between those things in their lives. And largely that means helping people carve out space for silence in their lives. Blaise Pascal said that. He said, appropriating silence isn't easy for the human person. But he said, I've often said, the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room. So promoting a taste for, and the habit of prayer and study. These are the two classical aspects of the act of contemplation. When I give talks to young adults on prayer or retreats, I also give them handouts containing lists of classic Christian literature, both spiritual reading, but also fiction and literature, because I think we have to give them something to replace their digital media addictions. We have to help promote their poetic imaginations. And the Catholic imagination is very analogical. It's very like Jesus uses metaphors all the time and parables. And there's the way religious truth comes to us through those methods. And if we've abandoned literature, if our young have stopped reading good books, then I think it really creates a stunted capacity for understanding Christ. So that's another. I believe in supporting homeschooling families and small startup academies and these colleges that are doing liberal arts and classical curriculum pedagogies. Okay. Another way we can be witnesses is bringing young adults, or any people, but young adults particular, to encounter Christ in the real of the other, is how I put it. For a number of years, I was taking young adult groups to the far north of Canada, to these indigenous communities in the Arctic and the subarctic, and they had to unplug for these trips. And I'm convinced they met Christ there. In their reflection papers, they'd write beautiful things, finding their vocation, which generally meant they wanted to be teachers and go live up there. Some of them went back to the north on their own. These are like 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. They went and volunteered up there. So, the poor, they image the beauty and luminosity of Christ better than almost anything else. And they're so real, right? So, continuing our mission of this preferential option for the poor and for encounter, what Pope Francis calls this culture, promoting a culture of encounter. I think that's antidotal to the disincarnational miasma of the internet. Finally, I'll just end with this, dear brothers, and thank you so much for your patience listening to me today. A little theological reflection here. Who was man before the fall? Man is God's highest creation, and he's placed in this environment where he can be happy and prosper. And there's no real need for technology in the garden. There's no need for labor-saving devices or time-saving devices. That doesn't enter into the logic of love, which characterizes Eden. The only improvement that Adam and Eve seek is based on a lie told them by the serpent. And it introduces an imbalance in the sense ratios of the original humans. You know, there used to be this hierarchy of sense. Hearing was the highest, then seeing, and then smelling, touching, and tasting, and so on. Hearing, then seeing. And Adam and Eve walked in the garden, and they're continuously in this acoustic presence of the Lord, but not visual. We don't hear Genesis describe a visual representation of God himself. But they're listening to God. And then it's Satan's promise to Eve. Well, first of all, he points her gaze to the fruit, and she sees that it is nice to look at. And he promises her, your eyes will open, and you will know good and evil, and you will be like God. 3 parts to that promise. Your eyes will open, you'll know good and evil, and you will be like God. And like all good liars, 2 of the 3 things came true. Their eyes opened. They did know evil, but they did not become like God. And after the fall, there's a switch up in the hierarchy of the senses. It changed from the order of hearing and then seeing to seeing and now hearing. And so idolatry will become the primary sin that God is trying to wean his chosen people off for thousands of years. And idolatry is almost always visual. Our first parents traded their ears for their eyes. And so their descendants will have to be reminded that faith comes from hearing, as St. Paul writes to the Romans. Faith comes from hearing. And faith is the evidence of things unseen. Hebrews. And so while our parents did not become like God, what is it that digital media is at its essence trying to offer us? Is it trying to sell us that we can become omniscient or omnipresent or omnipotent? You know, the smartphone carries with us the promise of omniscience and omnipresence, but they don't add up to omnipotence. In fact, they seem to be robbing us of the very human dignity, identity, and purpose of humanity that God intended. And for this reason, I adjure contra. I work against, and I believe we're all called to be prophetic agents to bring people back to their true dignity. And to do that, we have to adjure contra. We have to act against these meta tendencies in our culture right now, and reconnect people with the real, through which we see the luminosity of Christ. Okay, thank you very much, dear brothers, and I welcome any questions or comments that you might have.
Father John Brennan, I just want to thank you so much for your words. You can't hear it, but I can hear some clapping down 10 feet below me, and I see many hands as well. And in the beginning of your talk, you spoke about how really wanted to answer the question, how do we keep media as a tool? Mm-hmm. One thought that came to mind is like, for me to answer that question, I should ask myself, what do I want most? Mm-hmm. And really have a twofold question there. What do I want most in the very present moment? What is driving me? Where are my desires? But also, more importantly, what have I wanted most? And if I can answer that question, it would be to have, as a friar, to have a thriving community and a thriving prayer life. And that's going to help answer that question. And what you alluded to is the use of the examen prayer. We don't have the use examen prayer specifically, but we do have a time at night prayer for examination of conscience, and many friars do practice the examen prayer. Many of us do practice elements of Ignatian prayer. And for us to reflect in the silence how those particular desires are affected, the desire for a fraternal life, the desire for a community life, the desire to enter into prayer. And I think that can answer the question how to use as a tool. When I joined 20 some years ago, a lot of that was, internet really wasn't much 22, 23 years ago. And a lot in our life was meant to preserve both that fraternal life and that prayer life, even just in terms of keeping things simple. We don't have microwaves or dishwashers, and that helps preserve and promote those aspects of the fraternal life. We can use, I believe, those same principles when it comes to media. What you said was so striking, and I knew, but I didn't realize how much, like even when you're on surfing the web, they're paying attention to how long you look at even just one particular photograph, and their aim is far beyond even just trying to tailor the advertisement for what you may like, but actually shape your mind, which is scary, to be honest with you. But so I just want to thank you for just bringing all of that to light, but also to have before us that call to not being out of date and not preventing us from engaging the culture and promoting the role of evangelization that we have and that we hold so dear, but first and foremost to preserve that vitality within our spiritual life and within our community life. So thank you. Just want to open also the floor to questions here. And again, as yesterday, just if I can facilitate it, just put the little reactions hand raise, and then Father John will call you. The Bronx can go ahead.
Father John, thank you. We have a homeless shelter here in the Bronx. And at night, the men who come in, they turn in their cell phones at night and pick them up in the morning as they go out of the shelter. But occasionally, there are days because of the weather or various reasons, they get to stay in. And if I don't give them their phones, they get so agitated during the day or antsy. They almost prefer to be out in the elements than stay in the building. Now, just like all addiction, is this something that I need to kind of curtail little by little, or is it better just simply say, you know what, if you want to go out, but I'm not giving your phone during the day? Which is a better method? Do you think?
Oh man, yeah, that's such a great applied question. Everything I'm saying is kind of abstract, but you're bringing it to the real. Yeah. I can't really answer that question for you. I think you have to discern it in the, with all the context, that it is. Knowing the guys. So yeah, they're certainly addicted, but it's also we're all addicted, and I think they may also sometimes it's a mercy and a relief to be able to go somewhere else for a while. I actually really like movies. I love film. I teach film a bit too, but everything in its place, right? Watching a good movie, you can feel almost refreshed at the end, just like watching maybe an opera or a symphony or a play or something like that. It has the same effect. It's what Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe. It's almost a catharsis. So for a homeless guy, maybe he needs to kind of zone out for a while. I don't know. Obviously, the risk of accessing pornography is just so great. It's 2 clicks away, right? So now, are we to what standard do we hold the people we minister to, or if it's a homeless shelter, you know, that you have to determine, to what degree of restriction you can give them. Maybe, I mean, there's times like, so if I were to, by analogy, apply it to students when I'm with them on extended periods of time, there are times where I take away their, you know, would mandate that they unplug and we turn in their phones. But but exceptions prove the rule. If there's unusual circumstances, and this is probably the best practices I've seen in some of these programs, evangelization schools and things like that, where people are living together, is they provide finite amounts of time for people to do their email or watch a few things. So there's a time limit. So maybe that's the best middle ground, is kind of say, okay, we got an hour. We got an hour for media use. I don't know if you can do that with these gentlemen, but yeah. So because there's a law of, it's kind of like the physical law. You know, everything breaks down in the universe. It gets renewed, but there's a similar analogous law with our media use. The longer you stay on it, the more likely you are to start doing nefarious things. So do you know what I mean? Like it kind of, the longer, that's why we call it the rabbit hole. So first for ourselves, and yeah, I love all the policies and practices that you have as friars already. I think that discipline, it's not just prophetic for the world, but it's also going to guarantee better your own integrity. Basically, we're not strong enough to just use willpower when it comes to these devices. We're simply not. Any of you fathers who hear confessions, you know that. It's an advice I give a lot, is we have to overcompensate a little bit for the pull that these devices have on us. So we need, whether it's the buddy system, whether it's other forms of accountability. When I lived at the Casa Balthazar community in Rome, this is 14 years ago now, they had a computer room so we could write our papers, but they had a logbook. We were supposed to write down every website we visited. And you know what? I'm convinced nobody looked at it. I don't think a superior was monitoring, you know, what websites we visited. It wasn't like we were adults, but I think it was there for an Ignatian purpose, which was for our own sense of discernment, to live in transparency. If I could simply log down the sites I visited in freedom, then I knew I was probably in God's will when I was doing that. And that in turn helped keep my internet use instrumental, functional, purposeful. Like, so as long as it's our tool, it's okay. It doesn't seem to harm us, but it very quickly slips into being not our tool, and we become its tool, and that sort of thing. So with the homeless guys, I guess you'll have to navigate that a little bit. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry for my meandering answer there.
This is Father John Mary. Just more of a comment than a question, maybe just to kind of contribute to the conversation. Father, thanks for sharing all that you did. I just, for the sake of sharing, saw just a very clear kind of connection between that fifth principle that you threw out to us, this question of what is the problem to which this technology is the solution? Within our own kind of legislation, within the context of our own life of poverty, we talk about a principle that we have is the simple use of necessary things. And so I just kind of really saw a real compatibility, you might say a resonance between those couple of principles there. And so for me, it's just kind of affirming, you know, the goodness of that principle that we have, this idea of a simple use of necessary things. And it's just kind of challenging me to kind of relook at, you know, my use of media, my use of internet. To what degree is that really necessary? How is it helping me to do something that is really and truly necessarily part of my, you might say, mission or my work. And even if it's necessary, is it simple, or is it sort of becoming overly complex to the point where it's more of a burden than a help? And so, yeah, more of a comment than anything, Father. But just thank you for bringing that out, and just wanted to share that clear connection that I see between a principle that we have at work and a principle that you're proposing for good discernment. So thank you.
Thanks, Father John Mary. Excellent. Yeah. And simplicity is a gospel value. It's a gospel value for all Christians. And yeah, and intentionality. And I would advocate discerning our interior motions too. Like that's how we really can know at a personal level if our usage of the internet was not simple, if we had crossed the threshold into something else. Time is a gift as well, and how we use it, and scripture tells us we'll give an account for it. Right? So please thank God for his mercy on all of us at the end. But yeah, I think that's another phenomenon everyone knows about the internet, is just how it's such a time waster. Like it just sucks and it extends our use of time so powerfully. So yeah, countering it. How does it make me feel interiorly? Do I feel peace and joy? The recollection that is to be our default as Christians and as religious, or has it fragmented that in some way? But we have to reflect back, I think, on our experiences to really get a grasp on that and to establish the habit of that kind of discernment. But thank you. Yep. Was someone just stretching there? Or oh yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the talk. I just noticed with when you're talking about how the modern world has kind of jettisoned a lot of the ways of receiving truth that aren't scientific, and just kind of reflecting that this is true for probably most people who haven't grown up being intentionally raised and intentionally placed in environments where that's the case. So I was wondering, especially as Franciscans, it seems like being able to receive truth in ways other than just empirical observation is part of our heritage as sons of St. Francis. And so I was wondering if you would have any ideas or thoughts, starting points to kind of cultivate that faculty within, to kind of receive more poetically and kind of just receive and be in nature and all those things that you were mentioning. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for that excellent question. Yeah. Well, keep doing what you're doing. For one thing, you're already a living witness to those other modes of knowledge. Imaging Christ by your lives, the witness of your habit, the witness of your lifestyles. Music is another form of knowledge that the world just can't quite shake, like the power of beauty. The power of beauty, as Pope Benedict talked about, and Pope Francis, the via pulchritudinis. So, oh yeah. Oh, little confession here. I actually use as my alarm on my phone. I will admit, although I keep it in another room, but I can hear it from where my bed is. I use that song that one of you recorded, that Salve Regina, that solemn version of the Salve Regina. Was that Father Gabriel? Was that you, Father Gabriel, who recorded that? Or another Father Gabriel?
I think maybe another Father Gabriel, not me.
Okay, and some other maybe. Okay, I'm pretty sure it's the friars, CFRs friars. Salve Regina, right? Love it. Anyway, it feeds my soul. So I think music in a way that's appropriate to being Franciscan, that comes out of your own spirit of peace and good, and touches a lot of hearts. I think I don't know of any vocation where we shouldn't be reading the poetic outpouring. I mean, scripture is already poetic, right? Some of the books more than others, but essentially it's calling what the fathers of the church called the five senses of scripture, Maybe most of you know this, it's in the catechism now, but this recovery, that there's a literal sense, but then there's also an anagogical and moral and tropological sense, and anagogical. There's these different senses of scripture, but they all require imagination. They all require a bit of analogy, like being able to hold metaphors in our minds. That's poetry, essentially. It's a different kind of knowledge. So I think we should read. I think we should read literature, good stories. It complements our contemplation and nourishes our primary contemplation. So that's be another way. Nature, as you say. Something I did, I don't know if it's how possible this is where you're at, but during the thaw of the COVID, I would say in the summer around August and September, I was getting a strong sense a lot of people were really starting to go a little stir crazy. I organized pilgrimage. So pilgrimaging is so incarnational, and it's a metaphor for the Christian pilgrimage, for the soul's pilgrimage. So I think 4 or 5 different times I took these groups, mainly young people, but I went up to the shrine of Saint Marie among the Hurons, John de Brebeuf, and the martyrs shrine. It was closed for the pandemic, but we parked there and we walked along a path. It's about 14 kilometers, however many miles that is. Anyway, it was about a 3 or 4 hour hike to this site in the woods, which was the site of the martyrdoms of John de Brebeuf and Gabriel Lallemant. Powerful place. Every time I go there, I feel the presence of, well, the communion of saints, for sure. The blood that was spilt on that soil 400 years ago. And we have mass there, and we sing there, and so all these groups are very impacted by this. So pilgrimage, it's another incarnational activity that I think hits people, it impacts them. When I was a teacher, I really wanted to bring people to Jesus in the Eucharist right away, but I was finding I couldn't quite, I can't just bring people to adoration and find that they automatically encounter the Lord, maybe some, but there had to be what I call proto-evangelical activities. There had to be bringing people, we had to sort of prepare the soil a little bit and had to bring people out of their sort of mental cocoons a little bit. Hence these trips to the poor. Hence these pilgrimages on foot, nature walks, and then all the personal encounters along the way.
Father, we have 2 more questions. I believe Most Blessed Sacrament and then St. Mary's.
Father Luke, that's great. Yep. Next, does someone have a question?
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, okay.
You kind of answered it already. It was about that sort of proto-evangelical perspective. You were talking in the talk a little bit about, the way that grace builds on nature and how technology really creates this difficulty in receiving the gospel preached simply, as St. Francis calls us to do. So I was just kind of curious about your experience with young people and with sort of preaching this message. Like before I was a friar and when I was more plugged in, if you will, like I can remember kind of hearing some of this stuff and hearing about, books like The Shallows and sort of having this reaction of reticence that was like, this is just all the old people who hate progress. And it's kind of ironic now to be a friar and be on the other side of things, sort of. But even later on, my own experience kind of with confirmation, particularly confirmation or other younger people, just like an inability to, or not desire, not even to hear kind of the truth about what technology does to us because we're so kind of caught in it. So do you find it, I'm curious about your thoughts on like, is it something that you will directly preach and teach about, the adverse effects that you're talking to us about, or is it more something to be proto-evangelized, like indirectly through beauty or through experience?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Thanks, brother. Yeah, I would say all of the above. Just have to know our context. I mean, once I was teaching media literacy, so I could just have at it, and just really fire hose all the students with this stuff. Other contexts, nowadays, giving talks on Ignatian spirituality, I try and do it through the teaching of the examen, and I'll use examples because I know everyone in the room knows that they're addicted, and so that's my main example to illustrate doing the examen. I'll say I'll use an example such as maybe you were short with your brother or sister. So you're doing your examen. You've asked the Holy Spirit to illuminate your intellect. You're looking back on the last 24 hours, and you remember the Holy Spirit brings to your mind that you had that conversation with someone that was a bit off. It was a bit dissonant, and and okay, so you're acknowledging that. Then in the examen, you can ask yourself, well, why was I short with my brother? And because that's not me. I'm a loving person. I don't like being, short with my brother. And then in the context of the examen, you may realize, well, it's probably because I was tired. 90% of the time, it's because there's some natural cause to the reason why we do the things we don't want to do. We don't need to go right to the devil or to the evil spirits. We can be like, yeah, I didn't get enough sleep last night. But then I might ask myself, why didn't I get enough sleep last night? And this is a great question to ask young people. Then I'll remember, oh, it's because I was up till 2 a.m. gaming or surfing the internet or what have you. We don't even have to invoke pornography. We can just be like, maybe it didn't even go that far, but nonetheless, you were up really, really late. Then you can ask yourself in your examen, was there a moment earlier in the night where the little voice spoke into my soul and said, okay, you've used the internet as your tool. Maybe you've had a bit of entertainment. Maybe you've watched your favorite show, an episode, or maybe 2 episodes, and that's good enough. And the little voice said, now close it down and go to bed. And what did you do? There was a moment of choice where you shut out the voice and you said, nope. And that's the original sin. That's the concupiscent sort of spirit within that says, nope, I want more of this. I want more ice cream. And so you ended up staying up till 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. And what this does is it trains you, I will tell them, to not just look at the external results of our actions. That's maybe a more moralistic evaluation. Preparing for confession, we can kind of say I was rude or crude or short with my brother, but this helps us locate the seed of it, where we actually said no to God. If sin is a rupture of the great yes, that we should be living in the great fiat of our lives to God, and it's only when we introduce a no. If that's true, the examen helps us identify where the no was. But to do that, we have to look back, and then we can see the chain reaction, the cause and effect chain that led to the external manifestation of a sin, what we classically would call a lack of charity, for example. So that's how I teach young people to be more media literate, through the vessel of the examen and using that example, because everyone's struggling with that. There's also a pandemic of sleeplessness. People are not getting enough sleep culturally these days, and it's affecting their morality and their spirit and their general health. So I see that as a mission too. It's really to call people to healthy living. That's proto-evangelical. It's like, for the grace to work, we need to prepare the natural dimension. So help people order their lives a little bit. So I hope that helps. Sorry, was there one other question? Oh yeah, St. Mary's? Yes. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I sure can. Yep.
Hi, Father. Thank you. I'm Father Giuseppe, and I'm one of the least technologically literate friars in the community. I'm old and slow and not good with the internet stuff at all. So I'm very grateful for this. I think it's super important. As a priest, we hear so many confessions that good, holy men are addicted and falling into this big time. So many people are just so sucked into this thing with entertainment. I think there is a spirit of entertainment and distraction that's active in our culture. We hear even priests and religious who get sucked into this stuff. So I'm glad we're talking about it, so thank you. My question to you is to get your insight on, as we discern this for our community, how we should proceed. Two questions I have for you is, how much latitude should we allow in the community in terms of differencing of opinion and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? And how should we, in a sense, legislate this? Should we legislate in the sense of absolutes, or do you think that we should need to legislate more in terms of areas of discernment and topics for consideration and regular fraternal discussion? So again, how much latitude do you think is appropriate, and how should we legislate, either with absolutes or with suggestions or opportunities for discussion and communal discernment? Is that clear?
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you. As you discern that question, the balance between legislating absolutely or maybe permitting more personal discernment for the use of ... I would keep in mind what I've been alluding to a fair bit, which is that as much as we want to be able to exercise our free will, to have right relationships with our devices and technologies, that there's a dynamic built into the very design of the technologies that overrides our free will, or at least has a powerful, powerful tendency to override our free will. And that the consequences of that implicate our souls. It's not just about, I like driving a car too much, or, you know, I'm addicted to using a microwave oven. Like here, it very quickly is about introducing portals to hell. Very quickly. And we all know this from what our young people, like the evil one has just targeted the young because they're innocent. And that's what's happening at the global level right now with all of this. So if we are called to be agents of mercy and reconciliation to the world, I think we have to tilt the balance in favor of preserving ourselves from the tendency. So St. Ignatius' 14th rule of the discernment of spirits is that the enemy conducts himself like a enemy commander in a battlefield, who's always gazing at us and say we're defending our city. If you think of, I don't know if you've all seen the Two Towers from Lord of the Rings, when the Rohirrim are defending Helm's Deep, and Saruman's orcs are all there trying to take Helm's Deep. And they've been engineered to be these super orcs and all of this. But Helm's Deep has never fallen. It's never been taken before. But do you remember what happens in the story, what Tolkien has written? Helm's Deep falls. Sauron's army breaches the walls. And do you remember how he does it? Well, first of all, he's engineered through the technology of dynamite. He's this explosive. So it's like, for the first time in the Middle-earth universe, there's like this modern means of warfare. It's dynamite. And you remember the scene, that orc is running, and what does he do? He dives, he kind of kamikazes into this hole. It's like a drain hole in the wall. It was the weak point in the defenses. Saruman had sent spies ahead, and they had located that weak point. And that was the cause of the fall of Helm's Deep. It's a great metaphor for the spiritual life. And St. Ignatius says, our enemy is roaming like a lion, yes, looking for someone to devour, and we don't let down our guard. But then he says, but there is something we can do to preempt that, and that is to know in advance our weak points and what they will be. What will be our liabilities? and then we can shore those up. If the Rohirrim had been aware that they had this entry point, this weak point in their walls, they probably would have shorn it up, filled it up. So that's Ignatius's principle. It's to know our own weakness and know our own tendencies, because the evil one will exploit them. And if we know them in advance, to strengthen those particular areas, and then we'll be safe. Now, there was a last minute rescue in the story. Gandalf comes down the mountain with, obviously that's the end of the Christian story too. It's the final victory will be the Lord's in all of our doings. But in the meantime, I think we have to be strategic in the playing field. So I would err on the side of care. Basically, just it's been alluded to a lot. Use them as your tools, and create the safeguards to keep them tools. And if it's not needed as a tool, rid yourself of them. That's what Ignatius says in his Principle and Foundation. He says, everything on the face of the earth is good. It's been created for us, including our arts and technologies, to assist us for the end and purpose of our being, which is the praise, reverence, and service of God. Everything's there to help us live that vocation, reach that end. And so that's where the famous notion of indifference comes in. Ignatian indifference is, it's not apathy. It's that I'm free to embrace or to exclude from my life things based upon whether they're nourishing and supporting my ultimate vocation. So is it helping me reach my vocation to pray? This is a human vocation. This is universal vocation, the praise, reverence, and service of God. If it's helping me, good, use it. I mean, we're using Zoom right now. I'm using a MacBook Air. And I may even ask if we can take a photograph of, if you'll allow me to take a photograph of the screen before I go, just to promote our doings. But if it's not, he's very practical, Saint Ignatius. He's like, if it's proving to be an obstacle, rid yourself of it. So let's be strategic and prudent, I think, in all of this. I'm not free. Like, I've learned I can't bring a laptop into my bedroom. I don't, what else don't I do? I got a wristwatch again because I found I was bringing the phone out of my pocket just to check the time, probably 12 times a day. But every time I did it, I would very quickly check my email. Okay, well, it was every single time I was wasting more and more time. So I stopped using my phone as a watch, and I got an analog wristwatch. Facebook was reminding me what everyone's birthdays were. And I was like, you know what? I don't want to have another reason to have to go on Facebook, which knows everything. In my office here, I bought a little wall. They're called a perpetual calendar. It's a little wall calendar, and it's the same every month, every year. And I put all the religious anniversaries, all the birthdays I need to know, things like that. And every month I see it there. So I know month to month what the big ones are, and I can write my little messages and all of that in advance. That was another way to not be dependent on the media. So yeah, those are, I think, part of our prophetic witness in our day and age is to maybe err a little bit more on the side of living non-digital lives.
Thank you so much, Father John O'Brien, for your words, really words to help us to preserve our life and at the same time promote the gospel as we can and promote what's going to benefit our spiritual life. Maybe before I hand off the platform to Father John Paul for some closing remarks, maybe if you want to take that picture now.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, I can just do it from my computer here. But if fathers and brothers, if you wanted to turn on your video cameras, those of you who are not, thanks. I'll just, yeah, it looks like the Brady Bunch here. Because this was real. This was a good, nice, real encounter with you all. And You know, Father Gabriel kept saying, we'd like to get you down here to give this talk. And I totally would have come down, because even though it's probably the same talk I would have given, I believe in the value of being in person, you know, to do these things, to do these kind of encounters. But COVID and a major snowstorm, I think, rendered that not possible. But okay, anyway, thank you, all of you, for your kind attention to this today. It's really been a joy.
Very good. I just heard